I'm here at LSI Europe in Barcelona with Sadeq Ali of AccurKardia. Sadeq, thank you so much for joining me again in the studio.
Oh, thank you for having us.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing what's new. So why don't we just jump into that? You know, we met last year in LSI Europe in Hertfordshire. You told me about what your company is doing. What's changed in 12 months?
That's a loaded question. Actually, we spoke, I think, in September of last year, right? So back then, maybe even a couple weeks after we spoke, we did our first full FDA filing for our core product, AccurECG, and we received a response letter from them in, I think, right before Thanksgiving. And I think the response letter was the first indication that things were going well, because it wasn't an 18-page response letter. It was a letter with some very good questions, but we knew it was manageable in terms of what they were asking us to provide them with. So that, in some sense, put us into a really good mood going into the beginning of 2023. We had JP Morgan, which was a great week, met some really great strategics and investors there. And then the following week, we heard from Mayo Clinic that we were going to be invited to join Mayo Clinic Platform Accelerate. So the end of last year and the beginning of the year just started off with a lot of momentum.
I just want to comment on the momentum. You guys have accomplished a lot from what I've been following in the 12 months since we've seen each other. I know that you were also at LSI's event in the USA this year.
Yes.
That was
a lucky charm event for us, by the way, because while at the event, I think the second day of the event, we heard from our first institutional that they were ready to give us a term sheet. So it was unrelated in some sense, but there was definitely the karma coming from the event that fed into it. But yeah, that event was where we basically got the momentum as far as fundraising was concerned.
So you're speaking to the FDA last November, and it's my understanding that this June you guys received regulatory clearance. Yes. What does that mean now for you guys?
Well, it means, one, I can talk about the product more openly.
Let's do so.
Yeah, I think the clearance we received was for basically a Class 3 medical device. It is a heavily regulated device because it can indicate certain critical arrhythmias. So basically, we got the approval for 13 different arrhythmias, including some important atrial arrhythmias such as AFib and AFlutter, first-degree AV block, as well as ventricular arrhythmias like ventricular tachycardia. Given the type of arrhythmias we are diagnosing, they're very serious arrhythmias. It was the bar to proving that our analytics work was set pretty high. And that's really what took us from, I'd say, November through to the end of May. We needed to just provide the FDA with a lot more data than we'd originally provided them with. From our perspective, we had provided them more than what our understanding was predicates had provided them with. But I think the FDA's bar has gone up a bit as well. And we needed to comply with that. So it took us about a good 5 to 6 months to provide them with all of the information that they were looking for, which involved doing a study with a panel of cardiologists to make sure that they first agreed on what arrhythmia existed in, say, a 10-second ECG strip, which is not easy in terms of having 3 cardiologists agree on something like that, and then comparing that against what our analytics engine was diagnosing. So we took the stand that whatever the cardiologists annotated was the right annotation if all 3 agreed, and the system was compared against that. So that process really is what extended it through the end of May. we sent the response in, I think, right before Memorial Day, and like literally a month on, we got the approval.
So for your peers in the AI analysis and big data, I actually think you don't like using that word, right? I believe we talked about that last time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely, not to totally underplay the value of big data. I think what matters more in our space is honestly the quality of the data, and if possible, the ability to get longitudinal data, which is often hard to get, which is where the Mayo program was very useful, because and of course by then we didn't need the data for our core product because we had all the data we needed. We had done the submission to the FDA, but it turned out to be very useful from the point of view of building certain new algorithms, which are, I'd say, relatively novel in what they can do. From our perspective, we have sort of two core value propositions. One is in the space of the arrhythmia detection, which is traditionally what's done through ambulatory Holters, event monitors, MCT devices, and patches, and that's foundationally the core of our business. That's where we are focused commercially at this point. But alongside that, we've developed this thesis that the ECG signal is a potential biomarker, and a very broad biomarker at that. And there are multiple reasons for it. I can touch on those, but essentially, what's bearing out now is that the ECG signal can be leveraged for things well beyond what it's traditionally been used for. And there's a few reasons why that's possible today, AI being among those. But we then started to use the data from Mayo for diagnosis of things like hyperkalemia, for example, which is a disorder that matters a lot in nephrology, right? So if you have hyperkalemia, the potassium levels in your blood go up. Traditionally, the way the testing has been done for that has been through a blood test. What we have done is we've been able to indicate a moderate or high level of hyperkalemia using the ECG signal. For something like that, you do need a significant amount of data, but I wouldn't call it big data still. It's not in the same range of data that you hear of, for example, with large language models. We're talking about data from the entire internet, or it's not that scale of data. It's still relatively small amounts of data compared to that, but high quality data with, like, for example, it's not good enough to have the ECG signal data. You also need the blood test data to compare against, right? So those are the type of things that matter. So I'd say I'm still definitely much more of a proponent of the quality of the data than the volume of the data, particularly in healthcare.
You've given me a lot to unpack there with all that, and I want to touch on a few of the things you've just mentioned, but I do want to come back to something that stood out to me. You mentioned that your transparency with the FDA about how your AI algorithm works, it sounds like it was instrumental to guys having success with them.
Just for complete candor here, we actually, for our first approval, because our algorithms were performing very well, even without, so as I mentioned last year, we were using AI in a very surgical way. We are in some of our products, but in the product that has received FDA approval, because the performance was already relatively high, we took a different path. We decided to focus on the analytics piece with full transparency without the AI elements in it, primarily because the performance was high enough to support that. Our sensitivities for arrhythmia detection are over 96%, specificity is over 99%. At those numbers, adding the AI bit was only going to complicate the approval process. Wow. So our strategy was extract the AI bit out, get the approval, and then build upon it, bring the AI bit back in and get additional approvals for certain arrhythmias where we do need the AI bits. So the approval that we received in June was for the core analytics piece without the AI bits for complete candor. You know? Yeah.
So AccurECG is cleared. What device can we use it on today? How does a patient get access to it? What does that process look like?
Yeah, so today, the way that would work is a hardware manufacturer, let's say an ambulatory device manufacturer, would have to integrate our analytics capabilities into their offering, because we are not going directly to a cardiologist or to a patient or anything like that. We are essentially providing a Holter manufacturer or an MCT device manufacturer access to our analytics capabilities so that they can enhance their reporting. I'm not sure if you know how that workflow works today, but essentially what happens is if you, say, go to a cardiologist, they give you a Holter to wear. You wear that Holter, you may wear that for a week, a couple of weeks. You go back, you hand in the Holter. The data from the Holter gets uploaded to the cloud, gets analyzed initially by their software, but then there are these cardiac technicians, both in the US and offshore, that review the reports, annotate the reports, and finally produce a result. That whole process can take, from the time the cardiologist gets the data back or the Holter back from the patient through the time the patient is being provided a report, can be anywhere from 2 days to a couple of weeks. And that is a very, very long process. And it is an expensive process because there's a lot of cardiac technicians involved and there's a lot of sort of, human labor involved in that process. What we're effectively doing is we can reduce the time spent by a cardiac technician on each of those reports by up to 70%. Wow. So a single cardiac technician can go through, even for longer duration reports, many more reports an hour than he or she could without our software. But our software isn't meant to go directly to a cardiologist in any way. It is meant to support the Holter companies, the patch companies, if it is truly two MCTs, as well as event monitoring companies, to be able to integrate our offering into their solutions.
Is it going to be compatible with smartwatches and things of that nature? Is that a discussion you guys are having?
Yeah, so that's probably going to take us slightly. So we do have a prototype of that built already. Effectively, it's the same analytics engine in the back end. It's just the device ingesting the data is what's called has what's called a dry lead, whereas our approval at this point is for a wet lead. So if we are going to support smartwatches, the first step towards that is to get approval for dry leads. That's also critical for a lot of that's also critical outside of smartwatches. There are other use cases in which there are dry leads as well. But yeah, I mean, our goal is to get approval for dry leads to be available for not just the Apple Watch, but a lot of clinical grade smartwatches that are coming up as well.
Yeah, you would have access to a massive patient population at that point. I believe there's some 50% of people are wearing a smartwatch these days. So.
Yeah, and many of them are now being embedded with ECG sensors. So ECGs are this is the reason why we believe that, ECG has such a large value as a biomarker. And when we say a biomarker, we think of a biomarker at what we call a planetary scale, right? If you think of planetary scale biomarkers that have broad diagnostic coverage, that can detect multiple conditions, really 3 come to mind. And 2 come to mind to the general population. The third that we are trying to, in some sense, evangelize is ECG. The first 2 are blood and DNA. But there are some significant disadvantages with blood and DNA. Neither of them can be remotely or continuously monitored. They can be pretty expensive. Even a blood test can be expensive, but gene sequencing and DNA tests can be a lot more expensive. The time taken to get the results is a lot longer. And as importantly, it is really difficult for a non-expert to administer, let's say, a blood test, right? You need to go in and get that done, whereas with an ECG, you don't need any specialized training to record an ECG on your Apple Watch, right? So if the ECG can become that sort of third big biomarker for broader diagnostics coverage, the scale that ECG can achieve is truly planetary because, as you mentioned, right, 50% of the US population probably has some kind of a smart device, smartwatch. It's only a matter of time before the rest of the world has that as well. And then you need to have a solution with the features that allow you to get that scale and get value from that scale. And there are certain key elements that a solution like that needs to have. And we believe that even our very first product has all of those key characteristics. So we're very bullish on this idea of ECG as a biomarker and being the company that's able to deliver that.
So ECG is vital to identifying patients who have arrhythmia, but it's also, I imagine there's a lot of value that can be added with following these patients as they're being treated too, and understanding their response to treatment. Is that also what your platform is capable of?
So it depends on the integration, right? It depends on what with Holters, with patches, with event monitors. It's unlikely that you're going to wear it long term, right? You're going to wear it for maybe a few days, a couple of weeks, a month at most, right? In order to do continuous monitoring, which is where the value of, I think, something like ECG truly comes into play, you do need to have a device that's more of a wearable, right? But once you have that wearable, you can not just monitor the individual from the point of view of arrhythmias, but you can go well beyond arrhythmias. I'll give you an example of an area where we are truly excited and are spending a lot of our time, right? So at the Mayo Clinic, we developed, as part of Platform Accelerate, we developed an algorithm for hyperkalemia detection. So what is hyperkalemia? It's high potassium levels in the blood. Now you might think of that as being, okay, is that somewhat esoteric? Well, let me just give you some numbers, right? 750 billion a year is spent by Medicare in the US every year, right? Of that, 25% is spent on chronic kidney disease. Chronic kidney disease, a large percentage of people with chronic kidney disease, also end up with end-stage renal disease. About 40% of people with end-stage renal disease die not because they cannot get a kidney replacement, but because of hyperkalemia. So just to give you some context of scale, the scale for hyperkalemia detection, if it can be done through an ECG, is massive, right? In terms of the current gold standard, it's through a blood test. But the issue with the blood test is there are two issues. One is it takes longer to get the results, and it's more complicated, right? You have to go in, have your blood drawn. It can take easily 4 hours before you know what's going on. The other is hyperkalemia is potentially fatal. Particularly high levels of hyperkalemia, it needs to be acted on immediately. So you don't have time for a blood test, right? A lot of times it's just based on symptoms. You're not even sent to a dialysis center. If you show up at a dialysis center saying, hey, I think I have high potassium, you are immediately whisked off to an ER. And an ER visit costs a lot of money, So from that point of view, the benefit to the entire health system in some ways, if hyperkalemia, particularly when it isn't dangerous yet, right, can be identified, makes be hugely beneficial. And if you can monitor that through a smartwatch, nothing like it. So even with the algorithms that we developed, we've done it using lead one data only. So why is that important? Well, the Apple Watch works off of the lead one. It's not a full 12 lead, right? So it works off lead one. And our algorithm, at least we did retrospective study with about 20,500 patients with Mayo Clinic data as part of the program. And it performed brilliantly. We had sensitivities of about 81%, specificities around 83, which specificity basically limits your false positives, and AUC, it's something that's used to calculate how efficient not just how efficient, but how effective your algorithm is overall, balancing both accuracy and false positives, or I should say, true positives and false positives. And that number comes out to around 89%. And we've already done some validation outside of Mayo Clinic data, and the numbers are largely holding. So we're as excited about some of these new things that we're developing as we are about the arrhythmia use case. And to your point, once we can start integrating these algorithms, not just with the more traditional devices, but with smartwatches and other types of wearables, a whole universe of opportunities open up.
Yeah, absolutely. We're all familiar, I think, with continuous glucose monitoring solutions. We're talking here about continuous electrocardiogram monitoring, a new product category.
Yeah, and frankly speaking, right, like a glucose monitor is going to give you one piece of data. It is I mean, diabetes is obviously a very, very large problem, but even diabetes, like just to give you some, not to overwhelm everyone with numbers, but if you think about the numbers of diabetes, right, there's about, I think, close to 6% of the world population that has diabetes, of which a very large percentage is type 2 diabetes. The US alone, I think it's something like 32.3 million, which is about 10%, or 1 in 10 people in the US, right? Type 2 diabetes leads to chronic kidney disease. Chronic kidney disease leads to cardiovascular disease. People with stage 4 and 5 chronic kidney disease, 40 to 50% of them die due to cardiovascular complications, everything from fatal arrhythmias through to heart failure. So frankly speaking, these metabolic diseases and cardiovascular disease are heavily interrelated. So when you're monitoring someone for cardiovascular disease or you're monitoring someone for hyperkalemia, you're monitoring a spectrum that goes across different conditions. These comorbidities play off each other. The impact goes well beyond purely cardiovascular or purely metabolic diseases.
Yeah, it is truly exciting to hear the progress you guys are making.
Yeah, and those are, with ECG, the reason we're so sort of enamored by the ECG signal is because it literally is, in some ways, a treasure trove of data. And it's also very unique to an individual. I don't know if I mentioned this the last time we spoke, but every individual's ECG is different to a point where ECG can be leveraged as a biometric. There are papers written about this. People have built prototypes on this, right? So the changes to an ECG then become critical as both an indicator of health and disease. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I ended up with the Delta variant of COVID, and I was tracking my ECG meticulously throughout. I could see what happened when I was starting to fall sick, to when I was actually sick, to when I started feeling healthy again, right? So those changes show up in your ECG. And if those changes are visible to me as an untrained user in some sense with my naked eye, can you imagine what it is to a trained algorithm that can look at, 100 different parameters all at once? So the ability for the ECG to be able to even predict what might be about to happen is enormous. It's still preliminary, but we have seen in certain disease conditions that are actually, fatal disease conditions. There are no cures for some of them, but there are drugs that are starting to come up that extend life. We are finding ECGs picking up those markers. This is why we call it a biomarker, years before the condition actually manifests and the person ends up in needing care, right? By which time it's even more difficult to give them that care. So that's why we're very, very excited about this, right? It's the closest comparison to what ECG can do, right? And the electrical signal from your heart, the closest comparison, and of course, I think, there are limits to that comparison, is DNA, right? Like the DNA can tell you a lot about how an individual's health might progress over time. But the DNA is interesting because with DNA, it's not just whether you have a gene or not that matters. It's your epigenetics matter as well. So the DNA is in some sense the hardware, and the epigenetics is the software that triggers the manifestation of a certain condition. So you may have a gene for something, but it doesn't mean you're going to get that, right? With ECG, it is showing that you're actually, in some sense, that condition is starting to manifest, right? So yes, it may not be able to tell you that at birth, which with DNA can, but as that risky condition starts to approach, you start to get notified, right? If we can harness that data, everything we've been speaking about for years in terms of, preventative medicine, predictive medicine, all of that becomes possible, right? So effectively, you're then able to truly transform the way in which healthcare is done. That's ultimately the vision here, right? The ability to be able to take healthcare, which is right now a lot more reactive and based on symptom solution, to, all right, symptom is starting to manifest. It may still be years away from actually becoming a problem, but let's do something about it. Let's start to at least monitor it more closely, even if you don't do anything about it, and doing it in a way that doesn't raise too many false flags and, where it becomes a situation of crying wolf. That's why in something like this, as important as it is to optimize for, true positives and true negatives, it is equally as important to optimize for false positives, so people are not constantly alarmed and doctors are not you don't want an already burdened health system to be even more burdened. You want to help the health system react better.
You guys have developed a solution that can closely follow that epigenetic expression of diseases, but based on a technology that, again, 50% of people have.
It's also it's not a new technology, right? ECGs have been around for over a century. It's just that the capabilities that were needed from the point of view of specifically the AI capabilities, the compute needed to run the AI, all of that was just not there until now, right? So now that it is here, I think we can do a lot more than at least up to this point we've thought that we could with the ECG. It's definitely going to remain a critical part of the sort of traditional cardiologist's toolkit, but I think it's going to start to do things well beyond what it was originally meant for.
Maybe if we shift gears a little bit here, this is your third LSI, if I'm understanding correctly. Why do you guys keep coming back?
Honestly, we've gotten a lot of value out of it in terms of, like, I'll give you an example from the last LSI, right? The idea the hyperkalemia model we already had in mind. We definitely wanted to pursue that path, but we met an individual. I'm not going to name the company at this point, but it was a large tower manufacturer, I guess, that basically said, hey, if you can use ECG data to tell us if someone might be suffering from AVS, which is aortic valve stenosis, that could be very, very useful. If you think about it, again, it comes down to the ease of getting an ECG versus how a valve issue is today determined, right? So if someone has AVS today, the gold standard for that is an echocardiogram. But an echocardiogram is administered like once every 4 years or something like that. ECG can be administered like literally in a regular doctor's visit, right? So from that point of view, if we can detect AVS through an ECG, the value of that, both from the point of view of the patient as well as from the point of view of the device manufacturers, is very high, right? That didn't come to us from our sitting around talking in a round table of brainstorming ideas. It came being at LSI at Dana Point and speaking to a TAVR manufacturer, right? So the value that we get both from the point of view of talking to strategics, from the point of view of knowing where the medtech community stands in terms of its latest and greatest thinking, and in terms of just meeting a lot of great and friendly people, has just been, and when I say friendly, I'm not talking about just, hey, hi, how are you, but also the type of people that can make the right introductions, and all of that has been very valuable.
So a lot has happened with AccurKardia in the last 12 months. What's the future look like for you guys right now?
Yeah, I think, so we honestly, it's a good problem to have, but essentially what happened was we closed our seed round literally 3 days before we got our FDA approval. And our expectation, and what we'd communicated to one of our major investors in the last round is a venture fund that was built by Banco Popular, and we were basically talking to their board right before the closing and mentioned that, hey, it could be 6 months to 9 months away, right? So that's really that was our expectation,
Yeah.
not 3 days after closing, right? So frankly speaking, we had raised enough from the point of view of building a little bit of a war chest, but also continuing R&D and all of those type of things. We weren't necessarily looking to aggressively commercialize immediately. That was not the goal of that raise. And while there was a lot of exultation that we got the approval, my immediate reaction and Juan's immediate reaction, Juan's the CEO, was like, it was almost like a oh shit kind of moment. Like, now we need to truly pull up our socks and start to commercialize. And the first part of that process is to go out and raise more capital so that we can commercialize more aggressively. So to that end, we are starting a Series A round in the next week or so. While I'm here in Barcelona, Juan's doing a road trip, just meeting certain people. And so just another big thing that happened towards the end of August is we were selected as quarterfinalists for the Digital Health Awards that are going to be announced at Health in Vegas. The finalists have not yet been announced. The winner will be announced at Health. We're hoping we at least make it to the finals. But essentially, Juan was in San Francisco on Tuesday and Wednesday, actually Monday through Wednesday, New York today and tomorrow, and then Seattle over the weekend, right? So he's like literally crisscrossing the U.S. before heading back to Puerto Rico for a bit. And I'm obviously here, so we're getting ready for what's going to be a very long fall. And our immediate next step is to raise a Series A round in the fall, while continuing the commercialization effort. So we aren't waiting to raise the Series A to do the commercialization, but we are very realistic about what we can achieve in the very near term. So we are basically, there are some interesting partnerships in the play with our core analytics engine, AccurECG. And I'm going to be spending a lot of effort on that in the fall, but alongside that, financing is going to be a key element of what we spend our time on. Beyond that, we've developed, as I mentioned earlier, we're very, very bullish on some of the algorithms that we've developed, specifically the hyperkalemia detection algorithm. We've done some retrospective studies already. We're extending that out to do additional retrospective studies with large hospital health system in Texas. And hopefully shortly after that, or maybe even in parallel, do a prospective study as well, and start looking at the regulatory pathway on that as well. So, there's a lot of work essentially this fall between clinical, R&D, fundraising, and of course commercialization of what we've already achieved with AccurECG.
It's been great catching up and hearing what's new in the last 12 months since you and I last spoke, and I look forward to the next 6 to 12 months and what it holds for your company. Sadeq, thank you so much for joining me in the studio.
Thank you for having me, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And as I mentioned before, last year was awesome. It was, and it's been equally so up to this point. Thank you.
Excellent.